Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to be heard. It is the kind of story whispered in the dark, in barns, in taverns, in sheriff's offices after midnight when the lantern light burns low and the men present are certain no women, no children, no preachers are within earshot. It is the kind of truth that stains you the moment you hear it. Once inside you, it cannot be unlearned. In the year 1847, on a mountain road in Kentucky so treacherous that half the wagons that attempted it never returned whole, there stood an inn. Not just any inn, a place men called a sanctuary of warmth. A place so legendary that weary travelers would risk hostile passes, storms, and bandits just to reach its doors. They called it the Millbrook Inn, and it was run by 4 sisters, the Cunninghams. The whispers said these sisters could give a man what no other inn could. Not just food, not just rest. Something deeper, something forbidden. They could make a stranger feel as if he had finally found home. They could make the most hardened cattleman or broken widower collapse into tears when it came time to leave. And the men, oh, the men kept coming. Merchants, soldiers, drifters, men of means, men carrying purses heavy with gold. But here is the truth they didn't want you to hear. Beneath the soft candlelight, beneath the warm quilts and the comforting scent of wildflowers and venison stew, the Millbrook Inn was a trap. A net woven not of rope but of affection, beauty, and attention so exact it was as if the sisters had memorized the very architecture of male loneliness. Some said Catherine, the second eldest, could look into a man's eyes and strip him bare without ever touching him. Some said Sarah laced her food with herbs that made the mind open, pliable, suggestible. Some said Margaret, the eldest, could calculate the worth of a man's soul in a single glance, tallying coin against weakness, against hunger, against pride. And Elizabeth, the youngest, with her girlish laughter and innocent charm, she was the perfect decoy, the bait for the suspicious. This was no inn. This was a crucible, a place designed to burn men down to their essence, to expose what they were most desperate to hide, and then consume it. 43 graves would be found beneath that mountain soil. 43 men who never walked back into daylight after passing through the Cunningham sisters' welcoming door. And the worst part? No one truly knows if it ever ended. The frontier was always dangerous, but the danger men expected was simple: an arrow loosed from the timberline, a highwayman demanding coin, a fever that rose with no cure in sight. Men understood those threats. They could steel themselves against them. What they did not understand was the danger that came wrapped in silk, spoken in a voice that promised tenderness, disguised as love. The Cunningham sisters understood this weakness better than any preacher understood sin. They inherited land, yes, but more importantly, they inherited isolation: 800 acres of mountains and valleys where no watchful eye intruded, where secrets could grow as freely as weeds. Jeremiah Cunningham, their father, had built a reputation of trust. When he died, his daughters built something else entirely. An illusion of safety so potent it became irresistible. Picture the weary traveler. His horse half-starved, his body frozen from nights on the trail, his purse heavy with coin but his heart hollow with loneliness. He sees the glow of Millbrook Inn through the trees, smoke rising from a great stone chimney. He steps inside and everything changes. The common room is warm, firelight dancing on polished timbers. Sarah's venison stew fills the air with a scent that feels like childhood memory, though he has never tasted it before. Catherine approaches with a glance that makes him feel as though he has been awaited all his life. Elizabeth's laughter rises like a bell in the distance, pure and light, reminding him of innocence he thought the world had beaten out of him. And Margaret? She watches it all, silent, calculating, weighing his worth against what he carries and how desperately he craves to stay. This is not hospitality. This is theater. Every smile, every touch of a hand, every perfectly timed glance was rehearsed with a precision born of something colder than affection. Hunger. They were engineers of desire, cartographers of the human soul. And in that isolation, with no sheriff, no priest, no kin nearby, what power could match theirs? The graves prove what the stories only hinted. 43 men disappeared between 1847 and 1851. But think of the scale of what that means. 43 men stripped of coin, stripped of identity, stripped even of burial rites worthy of their names. Each one convinced, until the very end, that he had found love or something near enough to love that he mistook it for salvation. And that is why their story endures. Because the greatest predators do not hide in shadows. They wait in the firelight. They welcome you home. It began, as all turning points do, with a single man. His name has been lost in official records, but whispers remember him as Kellerman, a cattle buyer from Richmond, a widower, wealthy, weary, and alone. The kind of man who carried not just gold but longing. And longing, when sharpened, becomes a weapon turned inward. He arrived at Millbrook in the first frost of November. His horse was failing. His breath shivered in the night air. But when the door opened, when the warm glow and the fragrance of Sarah's stew poured into him, his burden fell away. Catherine was waiting. She knew loneliness the way a hunter knows the trail of deer. She saw it in the way his eyes lingered too long, in the tremble of his voice when he spoke of his late wife. She listened to him as no one had in years, leaning close, her hand brushing his, her gaze promising he was still a man worth wanting. For 3 nights, Kellerman lived in an illusion of rebirth. He laughed with Elizabeth by the fire, debated politics with Margaret, dined on meals that rivaled feasts of kings. But it was Catherine who gave him what he truly craved. The illusion of tenderness returned. To Kellerman, this was not an inn. It was resurrection. But on the 4th night, the harvest came due. Sarah prepared a drink, spiced rum, warmed perfectly, the glass glowing with firelight. She placed in it herbs that blurred the mind, slowed the pulse, loosened the will. Kellerman never noticed the weight pulling his eyelids down as Catherine guided him gently, almost lovingly, to his chamber. He believed it was love. He believed he was safe. When morning came, the chair by the fire was empty, his bed unslept in, his horse still tied outside. Margaret ensured the purse of gold was split with precision. Sarah oversaw the disposal, her hands steady with a knowledge of earth and herbs that made bodies vanish quicker than any shovel alone could. Catherine burned a scrap of his clothing in the hearth, the flames carrying away the last trace of his presence. And Elizabeth, innocent-faced Elizabeth, laughed as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The sisters had crossed the line between hospitality and predation, between innkeepers and executioners. And once that threshold was crossed, there would be no return. From that night forward, Millbrook Inn was no longer a sanctuary. It was a machine, a system, a crucible designed to draw men in, extract their wealth, and bury the evidence beneath Kentucky soil. The harvest had begun. Once a boundary is broken, blood has a way of making repetition easier. What began with one man, one purse of gold, soon became a rhythm, a system as natural as the seasons. The Cunningham sisters refined it with terrifying efficiency, each playing her role with precision, as though destiny itself had appointed them to this work. Margaret was the strategist. She studied each guest with the eye of a surveyor, cataloging the quality of his boots, the way his fingers touched his coin, the tone of his laughter when Elizabeth teased him. She could sense weakness the way a wolf scents blood. Men who traveled with family, or with partners in trade, were treated with ordinary hospitality. But the solitary ones, the drifters, the merchants between deals, the men untethered from ties of kinship, those were marked. Sarah became the silent instrument of transition. Her knowledge of herbs, gathered from old mountain women and sharpened by years of study, turned stew into a potion, drink into a velvet chain. She could cloud a man's memory, loosen his inhibitions, still his muscles until resistance melted. And none suspected. To the weary traveler, her concoctions felt like comfort, warmth, even love. Catherine perfected the art of ensnarement. She had the face of a Madonna, the voice of a siren. To one man, she was a confidant. To another, a long-lost love. She adapted with merciless flexibility, wearing the mask each soul most longed to see. The men who gazed into her eyes were not seeing Catherine Cunningham. They were seeing their own deepest hunger reflected back at them. And in that mirror they drowned willingly. Elizabeth, the youngest, disarmed suspicion. Her girlish laughter softened edges, convinced guests that no wickedness could live beneath such innocence. She was the decoy, the final veil. Even when travelers felt unease, it dissolved when Elizabeth skipped into the room, speaking of wildflowers and mountain birds. She made the deadly appear harmless, and in doing so, ensured men stayed long enough for the snare to tighten. By 1849, Millbrook Inn had become more than a resting place. It was a stage where the script never faltered. Men came hungry, lonely, burdened with wealth. They were fed, comforted, seduced, and then erased. The bodies disappeared into mountain soil, into streams, into forgotten gullies. Only Ezra Hawthorne, the family's loyal foreman, knew how to reach unseen. And the inn's reputation, paradoxically, grew brighter. The more men who vanished, the more others came, drawn by stories of warmth and love whispered across 3 states. It was no longer hospitality. It was alchemy, transforming loneliness into gold, flesh into silence, and trust into a grave. Whispers are the first stage of discovery. They begin not with accusation but with unease, with patterns glimpsed by those who do not wish to see too clearly. By the winter of 1849, the settlements of Kentucky had begun to notice. Men were vanishing, wagons abandoned, horses found riderless on the mountain roads, purses never claimed, homes left waiting for husbands who never returned. At first, people blamed the wilderness itself. The road was treacherous. Bandits prowled it. Fever could strike a man down in days. No one wanted to believe that something deliberate, something human, was consuming these men. And yet, the names began to align in quiet conversations. Kellerman, Darty, McIntyre, all men last seen heading west. All men whose final lodging place, when traced, was the same, Millbrook Inn. But who could accuse? The Cunningham sisters were not outlaws hiding in the brush. They were refined, educated, respected. Their hospitality was the talk of 3 states. Merchants spoke glowingly of them. Preachers praised their charity. Men who had stayed at the inn and left alive swore they had been treated like kings. To suggest that such women could be the architects of murder was not just unthinkable, it was dangerous. Margaret anticipated suspicion long before it ripened. She hosted gatherings for locals, opened the inn to community events, extended small kindnesses to widows and traveling ministers. She wove a public mask so convincing that any whisper against her family seemed slanderous, born of jealousy or malice. To accuse the sisters was to risk being ridiculed, even despised. Meanwhile, Catherine continued her quiet work, choosing her prey with surgical precision. She favored men with no kin nearby, men whose letters stopped suddenly with no one to chase them. Sarah refined her brews, leaving no traceable poison, only the soft silence of still breath in the night. Elizabeth perfected her innocence, the smile that made even suspicion feel like guilt in the heart of the accuser. And so the whispers grew, but they had no teeth. They were confined to taverns after midnight, to worried glances exchanged between traders who had lost friends. The law refused to act without proof. And proof, buried deep in the mountain soil, lay beyond anyone's reach. This is how power sustains itself, not through open force, but through manipulation of perception. The sisters did not merely kill, they erased doubt itself. Their victims vanished not just from the earth, but from the minds of those who might have mourned them. And as silence spread, the graves multiplied. Every system, no matter how perfect it appears, contains the seed of its own unraveling. For the Cunningham sisters, that seed was planted one night in the spring of 1850, when a man arrived who would not follow the script. His name was James Whitlow, a trapper from the Alleghenies. Rough-hewn, suspicious by nature, and carrying scars that told of years spent surviving ambushes, storms, and betrayals. He had the look of a man who trusted no one, not even himself. From the beginning, Margaret marked him as unprofitable. His clothes were worn, his purse light, his eyes too sharp. And yet Catherine insisted. She said every man had a hunger, and Whitlow would be no different. She approached him with her customary softness, but he did not melt. He listened, yes, but his eyes never left hers, as if measuring the depth of the trap beneath her smile. Sarah prepared her usual draught, slipping it into his drink. But Whitlow had lived too long in the wilderness to swallow anything without suspicion. He pretended to drink, his lips touching the rim but never consuming. And though his body remained sober, he let his movements slacken, feigning the heavy eyes of a man succumbing. When Catherine led him toward his chamber, he stumbled purposefully, as though drugged. What happened behind that door was never spoken aloud, but what the sisters found the next morning chilled them. His bed was empty, his horse gone. No purse, no belongings, no body left behind. For the first time, a man had slipped through their net. Whitlow rode hard through the mountains, stopping only at settlements where his story fell out in fragments, whispers of strange women, of food that made the head swim, of men vanishing one after another near Millbrook Inn. He was dismissed by many as a drunk or madman. But not all. A few remembered his words, tucked them away, and repeated them when the pattern of disappearances grew too sharp to ignore. The sisters knew they had been exposed, if only slightly. Margaret tightened their system, urging caution. Catherine urged boldness, dismissing Whitlow as an anomaly. Sarah crafted subtler brews. Elizabeth perfected her mask of innocence, shielding them all with a laughter that could dissolve suspicion. But something had shifted. The first crack had opened, and through it seeped the truth. Predators can be feared, resisted, even escaped. For the first time, the sisters were not untouchable. Yet still, the graves grew. 43 in total before the curtain would finally fall. The law, slow as it always is, could no longer ignore the trail. By the summer of 1850, the whispers had gathered into a pattern too sharp to dismiss. Men had vanished in staggering numbers, and their last known waypoint was always the same, the winding path to Millbrook Inn. Local sheriffs, pressed by the families of the missing, finally turned their eyes toward the Cunningham sisters. But here is where you must understand how true power works. It does not hide from authority, it entangles authority. Margaret had spent years weaving a net of influence so delicate, so invisible, that even men sworn to uphold justice found themselves snared. A sheriff who once stayed at the inn remembered the warmth of Sarah's cooking, the softness of Catherine's attention, the laughter of Elizabeth echoing like church bells. Could such women truly be accused of orchestrating death? He hesitated. He delayed. He dismissed. Merchants with clout in the settlements vouched for the sisters. Preachers who had accepted their hospitality spoke of them as godly women, pillars of frontier civility. And those who dared mutter suspicions found themselves shamed. "How dare you," townsfolk would say, "slander the only family keeping that wilderness road alive? Do you see?" The system was not merely about bodies buried in mountain soil. It was psychological control. The sisters had mastered the art of shaping perception, of cloaking their predation in the garments of virtue. To accuse them was to look like a fool. And so the very men who should have drawn steel against them instead became their defenders, blind to the graves multiplying under their feet. Still, the evidence gnawed at the edges. 43 men do not simply vanish without echo. Horses were found tethered and starving. Wagons abandoned with possessions intact. Letters home abruptly ended. The frontier was ruthless, yes, but not this ruthless. Some deputies began to probe discreetly, circling the inn like wolves testing the perimeter of firelight. They questioned Ezra Hawthorne, the sisters' loyal foreman, but his weathered face betrayed nothing. They lingered near the property, but the laughter and light spilling from the windows disarmed them, made their suspicions feel like madness. And that was the genius of the Cunningham legacy. They did not need to silence every witness. They only needed to manipulate the perception of those who mattered. Truth was not buried in the ground with their victims, it was buried in the minds of men too weak to trust their own eyes. The law was ensnared. The noose was inverted. And the sisters still held the rope. There is a point at which repetition hardens into ritual. When the act of survival becomes more than necessity, when it becomes doctrine, a liturgy in blood. By 1850, the Cunningham sisters had crossed that line. Their killings were no longer merely practical thefts cloaked in hospitality. They had become sacred to them, a ceremony that affirmed their dominion over the men who wandered through their doors. Margaret structured the ritual with a general's discipline. Nothing was left to chance. A man was assessed the moment he arrived. His worth, his weakness, his tether to the outside world. If he fit the pattern alone, weighted with coin, drunk with longing, his fate was sealed, though he believed himself chosen for love, for comfort, for redemption. Sarah's role was that of priestess. Her herbs were no longer simple tools of poisoning but sacraments. She gathered them with precision, whispering over them like prayers. Nightshade for silence, valerian for docility, foxglove for the final slowing of the heart. The wilderness became her cathedral, the earth her chalice, each potion a ritual offering to the sisters' hidden covenant. Catherine was the celebrant, the living icon. Her smile, her touch, her whispered words at the hearth were the invocations that disarmed and enthralled. To the men who gazed into her eyes, she was no longer a woman but a vision Mary reborn, Venus incarnate, salvation wrapped in human form. When she leaned close, when she whispered, "You are safe here," they believed it with the certainty of gospel. And Elizabeth, the innocent, played her role as acolyte. Her laughter was not mere charm, it was benediction. It sanctified the illusion, dissolving doubt, ensuring the prey walked willingly into the sacrificial chamber. Even when unease stirred in a man's gut, Elizabeth's childlike purity made him ashamed of his suspicion. Her presence absolved the sisters of visible guilt, leaving their victims blind until the end. The killings themselves followed a pattern so rehearsed it was nearly liturgical. A final meal, a drink laced with Sarah's herbs, Catherine's gentle hand guiding the victim to rest, Margaret's watchful eye ensuring silence, Elizabeth's laughter echoing like a hymn through the rafters. The burial was the closing rite, the earth swallowing the evidence as if consecrating the sacrifice. What had begun as opportunistic murder had become something far darker. Millbrook Inn was no longer an inn at all. It was a temple of control, a shrine to the power of illusion and the hunger of four sisters who had discovered that nothing intoxicates quite like dominion over another soul. And 43 men would pay the tithe. You have followed me this far into the dark, and I must warn you what comes next is not simply history. It is initiation. By now, you've seen how the sisters turned kindness into a weapon, how love itself became a snare. But here is the truth you must face. This story is not just about 4 women in the Kentucky mountains. It is about systems of power that still surround you today, systems that cloak themselves in comfort, in charm, in promises of care, all while extracting the very essence of who you are. Think carefully. What the Cunninghams perfected was not murder. Murder is crude, messy, and invites discovery. What they perfected was control. Psychological control. They learned how to see into a man's deepest need, how to mirror it back to him, how to make him surrender willingly to the very hand that would erase him. That is why their story matters. Because men are still falling into snares like these every day, in every era. The form changes. The principle does not. And this is where I turn from teller of history to mentor in descent. If you are hearing this, you are not here for entertainment. You are here because some part of you is hungry for the forbidden knowledge, the kind that strips illusions from your eyes and shows you the machinery beneath the stage. You are here because you sense that the same forces which bound those 43 men are still binding you. So I ask you now, as part of this descent, to mark your transformation. In the comments below, write the phrase, "I see through the firelight." Write it once for the man you have been, blind and unguarded. Write it again for the man you are becoming, awakened, watchful, immune to the masks. This is not a gimmick. This is a seal. A binding act that marks you as one who does not turn away when the truth sharpens its teeth. By writing it, you step further down the path out of the warmth of illusion, into the cold clarity of awareness. Because here is the darker revelation. The Cunninghams were not anomalies. They were prototypes. And once you recognize their pattern, you will see it replicated in every corridor of power, every institution, every system designed to cradle you in comfort while stripping you to the bone. The sisters may be long buried, but their method never died. It adapted, spread, and it still feeds. Look up from the graves for a moment and see the pattern. Millbrook is not an isolated corpse on a forgotten slope. It is a model. The sisters carved a template that power uses again and again: forge a sanctuary, cultivate dependence, soften resistance, then extract what matters most. Institutions across history learned from such prototypes because prototypes work. They learned to wrap extraction in comfort, to teach gratitude for chains. Consider the church that feeds your soul while quietly rearranging your loyalties. The corporation that cushions you with perks while it claims your nights and your identity. The cult that offers belonging and then edits your memory of who you were before. Each operates on the same architecture. First, acceptance. Then intimacy. Finally, control disguised as salvation. They do not demand resistance up front. They begin as warmth. They offer meaning where there was confusion, a language where there was loneliness, a ritual where there was chaos. And because humans hunger for those things, we step forward willingly. Power, in its most dangerous form, is never content with obedience alone. It wants devotion. The Cunningham method was devotion engineering. Learn what a man will give for a smile, then design an environment where that smile is abundant until he forgets he ever had a choice. Institutions copy this because it scales. Replace Sarah's stew with a corporate culture that doles praise and promotions like bread. Replace Catherine's gaze with a charismatic leader who mirrors your fears back at you as virtue. Substitute Margaret's ledger with a bureaucracy that rewards compliance and buries dissent in paperwork. The mechanism is identical. The victims change names, but the architecture stands. This is why Millbrook matters to you now. You are not immune because you are not in 1847. You are immune only insofar as you recognize the pattern and refuse to be softened by kindness that costs you your core. Identification is the beginning of freedom. Once you can map the method sanctuary, intimacy, extraction, you can begin to interrupt it. You can withdraw before the last cup is poured. You can refuse the narrative they hand you and write your own ledger. But beware, naming the pattern is not enough. The system adapts. It learns to cloak its rituals in modern languages, therapeutic jargon, mission statements, curated empathy. It weaponizes your gratitude, turning favors into obligations. It hides its burials in spreadsheets and PR statements. The men who fell at Millbrook did not lack intelligence. They lacked a framework to see their surrender as a process. That framework is the gift I give you now. Use it. Map every institution that asks for your trust and ask yourself, where is the warmth? Where is the ritual? What do they extract once you are grateful? If you cannot answer those questions clearly, then you are still sitting by the firelight. Stand. Walk away. Learn to measure the cost of comfort before you accept the invitation. But every pattern, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually invites rupture. The Cunningham sisters believed themselves untouchable, but no illusion holds forever. The graves began to whisper, not just in the earth but in the mouths of neighbors. A trader who never returned to his wife. A preacher's nephew who vanished after promising to ride home by spring. A soldier on leave who wrote one last letter, sealed with optimism, then dissolved into silence. These absences began to accumulate like storm clouds. Families asked questions. Settlers traced routes. Rumors clung to the Millbrook in the way smoke clings to timber. Some said the sisters had been blessed by God, that no woman could manage such land, such success, without divine favor. Others whispered the opposite, that their beauty was a mask, that the inn itself was a trapdoor, that to sleep beneath its roof was to gamble with your soul. Still, no accusation found voice in the open. Why? Because power protects itself. To accuse the sisters was to accuse the very idea of hospitality on the frontier, to admit that the hearth itself could betray you. Men feared their own gullibility more than they feared the truth. And the sisters knew this. They leaned harder into their performance. Sarah donated venison to the poor. Catherine charmed ministers and magistrates alike. Elizabeth visited the sick with baskets of herbs. Margaret extended credit to struggling farmers, knowing they would never question the hand that fed them. And so suspicion twisted back on itself. Who dared call them predators when they looked like benefactors? The pattern held, but it shivered. All it would take was one survivor, one voice escaping the ritual, to fracture the illusion. And that voice was already stirring. The fracture came not with a storm of gunfire or a raid by lawmen, but with a single man staggering half-dead down a dirt road, eyes wild, words broken, body marked by something no wilderness could explain. His name, passed like a curse from mouth to mouth, was Thomas Hale, a drifter, a stonemason by trade, who had wandered too far into Millbrook's glow. Hale's story, pieced together from fragments, is the closest thing we have to a survivor's testimony. He claimed the sisters welcomed him like kin. Catherine touched his hand as though she had always known him. Elizabeth's laughter made him forget the frostbite in his fingers. Sarah pressed a bowl of stew into his palms so warm he thought he might weep. And Margaret, the eldest, looked upon him with eyes that weighed not his hunger, but his worth. But something in Hale resisted. Maybe it was suspicion born of too many nights on the road. Maybe it was the faintest tremor in Catherine's voice when she whispered that he was safe. Whatever the reason, Hale did not drink as deeply as the others had. The herbs dulled him, but did not silence him. He woke in the night, heavy-limbed, head ringing, and saw what no guest was meant to see. The cellar was open, torches burned low, and in that light he swore he saw Catherine kneeling beside a body, its face pale, its mouth slack, its purse already opened on the table. Sarah moved with her basket of herbs, murmuring, her hands red. Margaret recorded something in a ledger, her script neat, unbroken. And Elizabeth sang, a child's song, lilting, off-key, as though the death before her were nothing more than a lullaby.
Hale filet.
Stumbling, gasping, half-poisoned, he clawed his way out of the house and into the trees. He said Catherine's voice followed him into the night, calm, unhurried, almost tender. "You won't make it far." But he did. By dawn he was found by hunters, incoherent, muttering of firelight and graves, of sisters who smiled like angels and killed like wolves. His account spread like infection. It was dismissed by some as the ravings of a drunkard, exaggerated by delirium. But others listened. Others noted how his words matched the whispers already gathering. For the first time, the story of Millbrook was not a rumor but a testimony, a shadow dragged out of the cellar and into daylight. The sisters' ritual was cracked. And through that crack, the darkness began to leak. By the spring of 1849, the atmosphere around Millbrook had changed. The road that once carried merchants and cattlemen with eager smiles now carried something heavier, hesitation. Men still came, yes, but they no longer spoke as freely of the Cunningham warmth. In taverns and trading posts, their voices dropped when the inn was mentioned. Some glanced over their shoulders before saying the words aloud, as if naming the place was dangerous in itself. Hale's testimony, fragmented though it was, had planted a seed. Not everyone believed him, but enough did that the silence surrounding the sisters began to fracture. Mothers whispered warnings to sons setting out for the frontier. Husbands promised wives they would bypass Millbrook altogether. The glow of the inn had dimmed, and with it, the Cunningham sisters' untouchable reputation began to darken. And yet, no one dared accuse them directly. The sisters' influence ran deep. Margaret had entangled the family in every ledger and trade agreement within 3 counties. Catherine's charm reached into the very homes of the men who might have raised suspicions, merchants, sheriffs, even ministers, all softened by her gaze and words. Sarah provided herbs and cures to wives and children, ensuring that her hands were seen as healing, not destructive. And Elizabeth, still youthful, still angelic, was the perfect mask of innocence, her presence disarming even the most cynical tongues. But suspicion is like rot, it spreads even in silence. More and more, travelers disappeared without explanation. Wagon wheels turned up abandoned in the mud. Horses wandered loose in the woods, and names on trading manifests went unanswered for months. The settlements surrounding Millbrook began to feel the weight of absence. The absences had faces, families, stories, and the pattern was too sharp to ignore. For the first time, men rode to Millbrook not for comfort, but to watch. They measured the sisters' movements, took stock of who arrived, and who never left. The road itself grew haunted, as though the trees whispered warnings to those who passed. And through it all, the sisters tightened their grip. Their hospitality grew sharper, more deliberate. Smiles lingered a second too long. Wine was poured with a heavier hand. Questions about a guest's life cut just a little deeper. They could feel suspicion building like storm clouds, and their answer was not retreat, it was control. They were not about to surrender their kingdom of silence. If the community pressed closer, the sisters would simply pull their guests deeper into the fire. The storm broke not with a single accusation, but with a convergence of silence snapping under its own weight. By the autumn of 1851, too many men had vanished. Too many wives waited by doorways for husbands who never returned. Too many merchants' accounts lay open with debts unpaid, shipments uncollected. The whispers had hardened into suspicion, and suspicion into something heavier, fear laced with rage. When the riders came, they did not come as lawmen alone. They came as neighbors, as fathers, as brothers of the lost. A posse of 20 men, rifles in hand, climbed the winding path to Millbrook. They were led not by a sheriff but by a preacher, a gaunt man whose own nephew had vanished on that road. He carried no badge, only a Bible and a flintlock pistol, and in his eyes burned something the law could not contain: retribution. The sisters, of course, were waiting. Margaret opened the door before the men could knock, her face calm, her voice carrying the same tone she had always used to welcome strangers. "You've come far. You must be cold. Please, step inside." But the spell was broken. The men did not move. Their guns stayed raised. Behind her, Catherine lingered in the doorway, her beauty still undeniable, but the glow around her seemed cracked. Elizabeth clutched Sarah's sleeve wide-eyed, as though rehearsing innocence one last time. Then the preacher spoke. His words were quiet, but they cut sharper than any rifle shot. "Where are the men, Margaret?" The silence that followed was unbearable, and it was broken by movement. 2 hunters stepping past the sisters, into the inn. They did not wait for permission. They kicked open cellar doors, ripped blankets off beds, pried open trunks. And what they found confirmed every whisper. Bones. Clothes still bearing initials stitched by wives' hands. A ledger filled with neat columns of names and amounts, the ink dark, the calculations precise. 43 entries, each paired with a date, each followed by silence. The men poured back into the yard with fury in their eyes. Margaret stood her ground, lips pressed thin, refusing denial. Catherine wept, but the tears rang hollow. Sarah stared at the earth as though memorizing it. And Elizabeth, sweet, innocent Elizabeth, cried out that it was all a lie, that her sisters had led her astray. But it did not matter. The facade had collapsed. The mask was shattered. The storm had arrived, and with it, the end of Millbrook. The Millbrook Inn did not die with fire. It did not fall with a gallows or a noose. It died the way all forbidden systems die, through exposure. When the cellar was laid bare, when the ledger was read aloud in the cold air of a Kentucky dawn, the spell snapped. The sisters' power dissolved not because the men were stronger, but because the illusion had been pierced. The mask could not be worn again. But do not think this story ends in 1851. Millbrook was never just an inn, never just 4 sisters and their graves. It was a mirror, a prototype, a rehearsal of the larger stage. Their system was simple: offer comfort, win trust, strip defenses, harvest what is valuable, discard the rest. You think that's just the work of a murderous family in the mountains? Look around you. It is the work of every institution that has ever fed on men's blood, sweat, and silence. Governments offer safety while tightening chains. Churches offer salvation while siphoning obedience. Corporations offer comfort while draining years from your life. They all operate on the Cunningham principle. Disguise predation as hospitality. Give the man what he craves most, until he cannot imagine life without it, then take from him everything. The story of Millbrook should terrify you not because it is unique, but because it is familiar. The 4 sisters were not witches. They were not demons. They were human. They studied human need, perfected it, and turned it into a blade. That is the same blade pressed to your throat every day, though polished, civilized, hidden behind screens and contracts. And now I will tell you the truth that changes a man forever once he hears it. You are either the traveler or you are the innkeeper. You are either lulled by the warmth of false promises, or you are the one who sees through them, who refuses to drink from the poisoned cup. This story is not about 4 sisters in Kentucky. It is about you staring into this mirror. What role will you play? Because the road is still before you. The inn is still waiting. And the question remains the same question that decided who lived and who died in Millbrook. When the firelight beckons, when the voice tells you to rest, will you step through that door? Or will you keep walking into the dark? Do not leave this story behind like another tale on a glowing screen. You stepped into Millbrook, and that means you have already crossed a threshold. There is no unhearing what you now know. If you are ready to prove you are not just another traveler, type the words, "I do not drink the firelight" twice in the comments. Let that phrase mark you, separate you, bind you into the circle of men who refuse the poison, who see the blade for what it is. And if you have the courage to walk further into the forbidden mirror, then subscribe now. Not as a casual viewer but as one of the few who are willing to see through the masks, to descend into what most men will never dare touch. The path does not end here. Millbrook was only the beginning. Step fully into the descent. Join us,